Welcome to the Arsenic Theory channel. Today I will be reading chapter 5 of The Next Million Years by Charles Galton Darwin. This chapter is called The Species Homo Sapiens. It's going to talk about the nature of man, how it hasn't been changing for the past million years, and probably will not change for the next million years. So let's start. The central thing that goes to make up history is not the external conditions of the world, but the nature of man himself. And this will be the subject of the present and the next two chapters. Man is an animal, but a social animal. And in discussing him, it is convenient to draw a line between his own inherent nature and the way he is influenced by the society in which he lives. So, in examining the man and his nature as the biological specimen, Charles Galton Darwin jumps into the evolution of man and how long does it take to actually make up the species. So he supposes, and he thinks it's 1 million years that it takes to actually make new species. And that's why he chose the title of his essay to say the next million years. So then he asks a question: is it possible for some part of human beings to kind of separate themselves, live in isolation, and develop into the new species? Well, he says it probably will take like 1 million years in order for that to happen. Obviously, there are conspiracies out there that right after the ice age or right after the deluge that encompassed the whole earth, certain remnants of people survived. And some of them went underground or on top of the mountain. Others just remained on the surface of the earth, surviving. And some people survived. And a small group of these people was able to preserve knowledge from the past eras, from the past generations of man. And then once the glaciers came down and the earth became more habitable, they came out from either underground or from the top of the mountains and saw these remnants of people running around. And what they started doing is slowly studying them and releasing the knowledge piece by piece, incrementally over generations to come. And their whole entire goal is to mold these people into kind of perfect slaves over time. And the way they try to accomplish it is by conditioning us, programming us into the mold that they want us to be. But in that case, they almost seem like a separate species, and some people claim they are. Well, if they are separate species, they have to be living among themselves in total isolation for a million years. Even the royalty and aristocracy that had existed for time immemorial, for as long as the written history had existed, they were never able to actually be in complete isolation from the rest of the people. They were either toppled, overthrown, or their children rebelled. They obviously intermarried with the peasants and other royalties. So there is no segment of the population of any race on earth that was able to live in total isolation. And even if they had, it wouldn't be much time for them to develop into the new species. Just take any kind of dynasty of the past and how long they were in existence for. Well, maybe maximum of 300 to 500 years, until they were overthrown by their own progeny, or overthrown by the peasants, or their blood got diluted by intermingling with other races. So to say that there is some kind of cabal of evil men or women manipulating everybody in the world like pawns on a chessboard, it's completely ludicrous. Nothing of the sort can naturally be possible. Then he goes on to talk about From the anthropological and evolutionary standpoints, all races of man on Earth are pretty much equal. There is no difference. As he says, there is no difference in brain and in mental character. Not something that any kind of anthropologists have detected. Therefore, when you consider, different variations of humans on Earth, they're pretty much, the same. They fall under the species of Homo sapiens. I think Charles Galton Darwin presents a pretty good arguments here against racism. There is no need for us to look at each other differences. We have so many things in common, more than we have differences. Let me read you this quote. There are, of course, obvious differences in behavior between individuals on account of differences of condition and of training or education, which I shall discuss in the next chapter, but it is correct to say that man really is one species, and that as such it will take 1,000,000 years before anything notably different will arise in his nature. And it all comes down to the question of what makes a Homo sapiens, a man, a human being. And it comes down to basically two aspects of our nature: heredity, in other words, the genes that we pass on to our progeny, and nurture is the environment that you're born into. So these two factors are the ones that mold human being into, who he or she becomes. Then Charles Galton Darwin goes into kind of long narration and elaboration on the genes, how genes are passed, from generation to generation, from parents to offspring, and how certain traits develop based on that. And here is an interesting quote that I would like to read. If a dictator should ever aspire to bring about some really permanent change in humanity, he could do it if, and only if, he knew how to alter some of the human genes, for only so could the changed quality become anchored as a fixed character of the race. So obviously, what does the dictator want? A dictator wants a docile population. A dictator wants a population that does not resist, does not question, and obeys every single order and dictate. It would be akin to, once again, the Brave New World scenario, where the population is controlled on a genetic level. Something that can be possible in the future, maybe even soon future, because there is a strong scientific research, very deep scientific research into the genes of what makes the human beings. I don't envision this kind of horrific scenario to take place here in the United States, but it is very possible that in the near future, I'm talking about in the next 20 to 25 years, that let's say that the Chinese or the Russian government will acquire this technology and start producing humans in mass, with the traits that they want. That is being palatable, being in agreement, being kind of happy, perpetually happy and content. Actually, not probably happy, content with their conditions, no matter how horrific or how debased those conditions are. And what will happen, the United States will see that and say, well, now they are having this comparative advantage over us. This, let's say China that is, mass producing soldiers, or mass producing factory workers, or mass producing some kind of other batches of human beings that are designed and created to work and succeed in a particular field. And the United States might as well just jump on the bandwagon of this genetic control and manipulation and say that we have to do that. Otherwise, we'll fall behind in this competitive, in the struggle for resources and life. So this might happen from that angle. But I don't see the United States adopting it, first. They obviously will be in the forefront of technological development when it comes to genes. But I think in this particular regard, when you want to actually mess with the human genome, probably Chinese will do that. also reminds me of the book by Margaret Sanger, the founder of the Planned Parenthood, called The Pivot of Civilization, something that I will read, next time, where she also mentions, this potential, and it was written, over 100 years ago, this book, and she mentions that there is, when it comes to animals, we control their stock. We, breed certain animals to, exemplify certain characteristics. For example, dogs for running or dogs for hunting. Why should we leave to chance the procreation aspect in the human beings? We should control that. We should control what kind of, gender will come out with what kind of traits, to ensure that there is no mental, physical deformity that the baby will have. So these kind of things are seriously explored by the scientists and the forerunners of the civilization. That's something that we need to be mindful of. What kind of control freaks are influencers, movers and shakers in our society? And the recent research suggests that, in the near future, we'll be able to choose, the sex, the gender of our, offspring, and that we can have our offspring to undergo genetic treatments to ensure that, certain traits and characteristics are enhanced and perhaps certain characteristics are eliminated. So this can be dubbed as a neo-eugenics program, right under our noses, guised under the cloak of science, progress, and human development and civilizational development. One might say that, I should not worry. And to be honest with you, Charles Galton Darwin was part of the Manhattan Project. And as I mentioned last time, under the original calculations, the atmosphere was going to set on fire, during the explosion of the atomic bomb, and obviously they had numerous, testings and explosions, and nothing was caught on fire. We are still alive. The Earth has not cooked itself. So perhaps with these genes as well, some people are worried that artificial intelligence and the manipulation of genes might cause, a catastrophe where humans will actually, annihilate themselves. It does sound kind of horrific and worrisome, but I don't know, we had came up with so many different inventions, and besides multiplying in numbers and improving our lot around us, I don't see any, horrific adverse effects from all the inventions that we had created thus far. So I can only presume that going forward, our inventions will continue to improve our lot and will continue to make our lives better. Charles Galton Darwin mentions that animals and human beings are magnificently balanced creatures, and that a change in one gene or one part of the genome might lead to the whole disbalancing of the entire human being. So therefore, there needs to be more tests, maybe even volunteers that will undergo the genetic treatments, and perhaps even have some people born where the genes have been carefully chosen in a laboratory, in a pantry dish, in order to see what kind of effects it will produce. And maybe it should take a couple of generations to see if there is any kind of long-term effects that the genetic treatments and manipulations have. So Charles Galton Darwin believes that man will never be able to alter and substantially change the human nature through the manipulation of genes. So obviously we read all these popular, science articles that describe one day where we will live in this utopian or dystopian world, where where each baby that is born will be touched by a genetic scientist, and certain traits eliminated or enhanced, depending on what the parents or maybe even the state wants. So the author of The Next Million Years says that this is too far-fetched and that it will never happen, because human beings are so carefully balanced that if you want to change one trait, you have to change other, traits and characteristics as well, in a gene, in a genome, in order for these changes to be effective and for the changes to be permanent. And also, let's not forget that, the natural selection is still out there. Evolutionary processes are still out there. How will the natural selection react to these mutants, whether in the animal or human kingdoms? For example, we know that domesticated animals, for the most part, cannot survive in the wild. Because they, require nurture. They require, food to be brought to them. They cannot go out into the wilderness and hunt for themselves and mend for themselves. So the same with human beings. Who knows how the nature will react? There is another evolutionary process called degeneration. What it means is that, let's say you have a genetic tree consisting of, families, parents, children, etc. And certain parts of the tree, certain branches will die off. They will degenerate through the process called degeneration, where, branches that are weak or not fit to exist in the world will basically die off through the lack of progeny. As part of a general discussion of Homo sapiens and species and what makes us, human, how we evolve, etc., the author goes into detail of, how our genes and characteristics are passed along to our progeny. So he mentions that, obviously that during the course of life, we acquire certain experiences, certain characteristics that are not going to be passed on to our children. The simplest and probably the most crude example is, let's say, if we lose a leg, any kind of mutilation happens or any other experiences, they will not be passed on to our progeny. So, he raises an interesting question of heredity. All the scientists back then at the end of 19th and early 20th century were discussing, the heredity, the aspects of it, and, most of them were eugenicists, which means, eugenics is a science of the betterment of human life. So what happened in the 30s and 40s, the person, who was named Adolf Hitler, basically took a hold of these ideas, which were very much prevalent at that time and before him for a while in the scientific communities in both Europe and America. So he took a hold of that and ran with it, which resulted in, deaths of millions of people, and therefore eugenics acquired a bad name, negative connotation. So after that, scientists still were looking at the questions of heredity, and they were still eugenicists. However, they had changed the name from eugenicist to the bioethicist. People like, Paul Ehrlich nowadays, brother of Rahm Emanuel, I believe his name is Ezekiel, he is a bioethicist as well. And so it completely changed the face, but the nature of this movement in the scientific community is still very much alive. I'm sure Charles Galton Darwin was a proponent of that idea as well. Another example would be Margaret Sanger, the founder of the Planned Parenthood. In one of her books called The Pivot Toward Civilization, she basically discusses also this, principles of eugenics, and she brings to light that why are we leaving our procreation to chance? We should be controlling the evolutionary process, so we can actually, because human beings, we understand what the better path that our children should take. Therefore, we should not be leaving it to some crude chance of nature. Instead, we should guide the nature. For example, we want to select certain characteristics that our children possess, because nobody wants a child who is somehow physically or mentally deficient. So we'll ensure to select the right genes and modify the embryo in such a way that it will come out healthy and fine and smart and etc. So some people say it's a dangerous game, but at the end of the day, that's what the scientists believe in, and that's what the scientists are working on. They want to eventually take control of the evolutionary process. And obviously, the problem is that we are not voting for these people to do their research, and we have absolutely no say in which direction they are taking us. If we had a say, if we were able to vote on it or have some kind of national referendum, it's one thing. But they are happily getting, all the different government grants and DARPA programs through the Department of Defense, etc. And we have no say. And who says that the next Hitler or the next Napoleon might not come around and use that technology for the evil ends? In order to solidify and prolong his power hold in the country. As we know from reading Plato, that every democracy ends in dictatorship. And if the United States also ends in dictatorship and doesn't avoid this inevitable cycle, the dictator will certainly use that technology in order to sustain himself in power. If one were to read the major philosophers such as Immanuel Kant, Plato, Aristotle, etc., you will notice that all of them discuss kind of the perfect society or the most efficient and effective society that should be constructed either on a national or regional or global levels. And all of them are concerned with how the governing body or the parliament should manage and conduct the most effective governance of their people. That's what they're mostly concerned with. And nowadays, the philosophers have transformed into the scientists over the last, 200-300 years since the age of Sir Francis Bacon. And so nowadays, what happens is the scientists in their compartmentalized positions work on the better management and the most effective governance of people through the use of different sciences, whether they are technology, artificial intelligence, or kind of the digital sphere, or microbiology, or chemistry, or any other field. They are working in their niche field in order to construct this social system of control. Then he begins to proceed in the narrative of which nations and which races will ultimately win in a struggle for life in the world to come. Of course, he's talking about in a kind of global, larger context, not necessarily some kind of smaller competitions between peoples, but actually between nations and different races. And he says that he says it's reminiscent to the game of chance between different players. So for example, if they have the same capital, they are sitting at the card table and going to play this game, it will be completely random who will win just because they have the same amount of capital. But if, let's say, there is one person or two people with a greater capital than the others, then they will have a higher chance to win the game than the others, because, for example, if they suffer some kind of great losses, it's easier for them to recover from them, and which would devastate their more poor opponents. So the same thing with nations. He says that basically the population or the sheer number of population determines the strength and the capital of each nation. Therefore, if any kind of calamity or crisis occurs, nations with a greater population will be able to recover from it, as opposed to nations with the smaller ones. that will be completely devastated, which kind of raises interesting questions that, for example, the US population is roughly, 400 million people, which constitutes less than, 4% of the total, world population. And if you take, for example, India and China together, that's over half of the world's population. However, currently they are not ruling the world. They are not even want to be the leaders of the world, because they don't have the resources, capacity, or the willpower, or even desire to be the leaders of the world. So therefore, they just focusing on their own economy, their own society, and the U.S. is still the leading nation. And if anything happens on a worldwide scale that will reduce the population further, or that will issue devastating blows to the nations, these nations, the nations with the greater population, will come out relatively unscathed, because they will still have enough people to work and contribute to their society. And unlike the United States, which is only 400 million people, not that many. So United States should think more what kind of relationships it has with other nations. It cannot act unilaterally toward other nations, do what it used to be doing during the Cold War, and just go in countries, for example, in the Middle East or the South American countries, and get rid of their leaders and install more favorable regimes that are favorable to the United States. Because after these regimes pass on and the leaders that were installed in America die off or overthrown, or any other unfortunate fate finds them, the people will still remember that the United States did meddle in their affairs once upon a time. I think the United States is not cognizant of the fact that the people in other nations remember every single ill that was inflicted upon them by colonial powers. For example, the Indians remember the British and the insults, the murder, the violence that was committed against the Indians, their ancestors, their grandfathers, their fathers. Even Japanese, who have enjoyed the security umbrella under which they were able to focus on their economy and transform the nation to the first world nation it is now, they will still remember that they were under the yoke of the United States, and that their two cities were destroyed and millions of people either died or had suffered excruciating pains and deaths from the radioactivity and radioactive poisoning. They will remember that. So the United States needs to be cognizant and mindful of these kind of things. People in other parts of the world do not forget. They do not forget what the big brother had done to them. And when the time comes, they will not only rebel, but, first of all, they will reassert themselves and their sovereignty and, their nationhood. That's exactly what happened in the Middle East. After the colonial powers left, all of them went into this uber nationalistic drive and established nations and became highly nationalistic. And many radical groups have formed in the Middle East, which, we in the Western world pay the consequences of that through the acts of terrorism that happen here on our soil. Why? Because once upon a time, the colonialists had entered there and they had put a stick in the beehive. And now the bees, after being wrestled and broken, etc., now they are coming out of the beehive and biting us, and it hurts. Of course, nowadays, instead of having, physical slavery and, other forms of subjugation through the colonial power that the colonial powers had enjoyed so much, for such a long time. Now what we have is economic slavery, financial slavery, where the IMF and World Bank, which are run by the European Union and the United States, they govern how the resources and finances are distributed across the world. And the nations that obviously have no say in it, even though if they might once in a while be in those meetings, they still have no say. So the United States and the United Kingdom, primarily this Anglo-American establishment, is the one that kind of rules the world still, and other nations will remember that. And it is quite apparent that the United States is still engages in a form of imperialism. Nowadays, it's cultural imperialism, something that other nations have been recognizing for a while, for many decades, and they have been saying it. Yes, you have left our country. You might not have as many troops as you once did during the British occupation and occupation by other European nations, but now you have a form of cultural imperialism where you are exporting not only political systems of democracy, but also your social progressivist ideas as well, in a form of gender equality, tolerance for sexual orientation, etc. That's something that is obviously welcomed here in the West, but does not really mesh in with other societies, and they see that as a new form of imperialism, which they have rightfully dubbed as cultural imperialism. Just to draw a quick analogy as far as why we don't have this indignation against people who will decide the fate of our lives and the fate of our children. Most of us are in some kind of jobs, and many of us can't stand, we hate our bosses, hate our managers, we think they're dumb, we think they don't understand us, we think that they're ignorant, etc. So why don't we express and extend the same kind of indignation and the same kind of criticism and the same kind of cynicism and the same kind of discernment toward the leaders that govern us on a world scale, on a national scale? Why don't we do the same thing? Why do we trust them completely? For example, nowadays, like I said, it's scientists who decide our fate, as opposed to the philosophers and the dictators of the past. We should have the same critical approach toward them as we do toward our bosses at work. Why can someone decide what my genetic history of the future will be? In the words of George W. Bush, shouldn't I be the decider? This is one of the most important chapters in the book. This one and also the consequent chapters will be discussing the nature of man. When you understand the nature of man, the evolution of man, and how the development of the human species as a whole take place, you will understand whether, all those conspiracy theories that have permeated the internet and have been more prevalent with the advent of internet, whether they are possible. Obviously, like I mentioned in other videos, some conspiracy theories turned out to be true because the government was engaged in a cover-up and was engaged in some kind of illicit activity. But not everything is a conspiracy theory. Not everything is the deliberate manipulation of the environment around us in order to inflict some kind of painful consequences on the population. And that's a problem with the modern peddlers of the conspiracy theories, because they look at every single event that takes outside of their house as a potential conspiracy theory. Everything. And I think it's impossible to live like that, and also it cannot be possibly true. It's almost reminiscent of God being in control of all your life. Like, you are, or like you are being superstitious. Belief in God, being superstitious, and believing that everything is a conspiracy out there. These are all very similar phenomena that is, dangerous and unhealthy, and does not create any happiness or even any understanding, does not enhance your discernment of this world. Then the author compares the man to other animals in the animal kingdom. And obviously, we are not superior to other animals in any kind of physical strength. The only thing that makes us different is our eyesight, superior faculty that endowed us with, how does he say? Let's see. The eyes which have a refinement of perception, and also our intellect. That's what sets us apart from other animals. It's our superior ability to not only conceive thoughts, but also we have a faculty of speech, and we can actually exchange our thoughts with our fellow human beings. That's what makes us stand apart. Therefore, we have to use those faculties in order to discern between truth and fiction. And, we should use our intellect not to fall into this cognitive and other traps that are out there. And it's not just conspiracy theories. Before that, there were all sorts of, which exist right now, all sorts of religious sects, totalitarian and quasi-totalitarian sects that are out there. Certain religious institutions that, demand that you give away all your earthly possessions and, come to them and donate everything, even if they don't ask you to donate, but they ask you to change your entire way and entire mode of life. I mean, that's kind of totalitarian as well. Why do I have to change my whole way of life because some leader of some kind of sect perceives it to be better than what I'm doing right now? Obviously, if I'm taking drugs and it has devastating effect on my body, I should not be doing that. But when you're asking me to, I don't know, to be celibate before marriage or not to smoke. I mean, yeah, smoking is not good, but you should not be banning me to smoke altogether. Sometimes I, like to have a, cigarette with a drink, right? Like social smoking. I mean, why not? Why should I not be allowed to do that? And fast forward to today, we have the media telling us what to believe, what to think, what is the next politically correct thing is. And as you can see, it never stops. It never stops. You are now afraid to say, million things right now. Tomorrow there are a million other offshoots, satellites that you cannot say, cannot think, etc. And I think it's like a ticking time bomb. It cannot go on like that. You cannot be politically correct about everything. Then at the end of the day, you can't say a thing. Or the only thing you can do is talk about these things among your, very close friends. And you almost live this kind of double life. You are in this world of doublethink, this Orwellian doublethink, where you actually don't believe it, but you either silent or you, conform, at least visually, with the other people when certain subjects are raised, either at work or any other social setting. The reason I say it's a ticking bomb is it reminds me of the Soviet Union. So Soviet Union existed for 70 years. It was a very strong system, a very holistic system. It had its own ideology, and it forced and compelled its people, their people to believe it. However, when the Soviet Union fell in 91, immediately people went into business. And just so you know, business, any kind of private enterprise, any kind of private initiative was forbidden and actually was, against the law. In the Soviet Union. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, everyone immediately went into the business, opened up their shops, began to travel to other countries, mostly to Turkey, to buy cheap goods and bring it back to the Russian markets and sell them for what they used to call speculation. Buy low and sell high. That's what they started doing. What it means is that they never, and just another thing also, pornography was being sold in the markets. I do remember that. All sorts of other things were being sold. Something that was, completely unheard of in the Soviet Union was any kind of items that were sold in the black market in the Soviet Union now are openly being sold on official city markets. And what it tells me is that people never truly believed in communism and its ideals. When they went to work, when they were in social settings, they always probably, majority of the people either said they are apolitical, meaning that they have no inclination toward one side or the other, or they simply ignored the subjects. But it means that there was no popular support for the communist ideology. The same thing here right now. I'm sure a big chunk of the population is not supportive of this politically correct environment that we live in. They don't actually believe what the liberal media is perpetrating on the main channels. So then the author goes deeper into the nature of man and what helps us survive as individuals and as a human race as a whole. So he mentions the death instinct, or the fear of death, as one of the matters that helps us to survive. Obviously, we don't want to die, and unless you're suicidal. But in that case, you just the weakest link, right? And also the sexual instinct and parental instinct. Up until recently, human beings, when they were engaged in any sexual activity, the consequence was reproduction, meaning that they begot children, just like animals do. Until recently, with the invention of birth control, that kind of changed the whole thing around. Now we can actually have more control, and we use pretty much like intellect instead of impulse when we engage in sexual activities. The parental instinct is very important because obviously you have to care for your children in order for them to be ready for this world. Then he goes into very interesting topic of adaptability. He says that human beings are more superior and higher than other animals in terms of adapting to unfamiliar situations. So if you place a wild animal in an environment that he's not familiar with, he will be completely lost. And humans are not. We are very adaptable. So let me read you a quick quote here. This flexibility of mind and the adaptability to unforeseen conditions are the main reasons why he has succeeded in dominating the world. He meaning the man. This becomes extremely important in the ever-changing environment that we live right now, as the changes happen with such a rapidity all around us that we do have to use these faculties and tap into them in order for us to survive. That means, changing your workplace every 2-3 years, changing career paths, maybe changing marriages. Then he gives a very humorous example of what kind of people are favored in Britain in the 1950s. It is basically, he says, a half-witted, completely irresponsible person that probably spent some time in prison, then gets out, and produces children quite promiscuously, and these children are cared for by the state and society and different charitable organizations. And this kind of parasite is the type that is at present most favored in our country, he says. If nothing is done, a point will come where the parasite will kill its host by exhaustion, and then of course itself perish miserably and contemptibly through having no one to support it. And before that, he gave an example of people who get promotions, meaning that people who get ahead in the society, those who climb up the career ladder, they are less likely to have more children. It reminds me of the movie Idiocracy, kind of a futuristic setting, which basically takes place 500 years from now, where only idiots were reproducing, and people with higher intellect that are more successful, more prosperous, they tend to procrastinate when it comes to begetting children. And therefore, when they end up, 40, 50 years old, after they had the careers, after they had focused on their personal and their individual prosperity, it's too late for them to have children. It's just their biological clock had passed, and they're not they have to use all sorts of artificial means in order to have children. And then they show like a trailer park where a bunch of hillbillies, just all they do is just reproduce, sit on a couch, drink beer, eat fried chicken, and reproduce, right, and have a bunch of children. And so eventually, 500 years from now, the world turned out to be a bunch of idiots because only they were reproducing. Then he looks at another example of a human being, which he calls a hero in a Homeric sense, in a sense used by Homer. And not Homer Simpsons, of course, but by the Greek writer Homer. And so according to Homer, the hero is basically kind of like semi-barbaric person who is selfish, undisciplined, and something of a bully, he says over here, and kind of he cares very little for the suffering and miseries of others unless they are part of his inner circle or part of his gang, so to speak. And then he asks a question: can this kind of person be fit and survive in a modern world, in a modern, densely populated world? And his conclusion: probably not, because he can obviously find himself probably find himself in a position of leadership, but he will have to dissociate, meaning he has to get rid of certain less desirable characteristics that he possesses. He cannot be this, completely selfish person and kind of this Machiavellian person to go over people's heads. He would have to, coexist with other people, especially if in densely populated countries. So I think he just, looks at different types of human beings and who would ultimately be fit to survive in the world to come. And so I think what he's trying to say is that people who will be able to adapt to the ever-changing environment are the ones who will survive. And the modern inventions, whether they are artificial intelligence, biochemistry, or any kind of robotics, they do not nullify and negate these perennial questions of survival, adaptability, and the nature of things. No matter what kind of sophisticated technology we create for ourselves, we are still faced with the same questions that have always been raised by philosophers and just regular people of the past. Who are we? What are we doing here? Where are we going? And ultimately now we've been asking another simple question: how do you survive? And what kind of characteristics you should possess, or what kind of skill set you should gain in order to survive in the modern world. So, for example, education for the past probably 100 years or less, even depending on the country, has been at the forefront tools that you had to have in order to be successful in a society. However, nowadays, that particular thing is waning. It's going away. Some companies have been actually dropping off education from their job requirements. So physically speaking, according to the Charles Galton Darwin, physically speaking, man will probably stay the same. His skin might become darker over time, his complexion, so it can be more adaptable to the sun rays. But here is another excerpt. It is the intellectual qualities of man that really matter, and so it will be these that are the most liable to change, because intellect, that's the only thing that makes us superior among other animals. And that's something that we'll continually focus on as the human race in the years, decades, centuries, and millennials to come. Therefore, that's the only thing that he foresees to be changing in the future, as opposed to any kind of, physical attributes. So he's saying that, if you continually focus on intelligence, we'll become cleverer, more smart in the future. And I think with the advent of all this, artificial intelligence and robotics, it'll probably, create technology that will be focused on enhancing our intellectual cognitive abilities. That's something that Ray Kurzweil has been researching with his under the umbrella of singularity, the great merger between the man and the machine. And that's something that has been focused more not necessarily improving our physical qualifications, but more of amplification of our intellectual capacity. Then a funny sentence over here. I have to read that. It's just so funny. It is by no means so clear that he will become morally better as well, since in a highly competitive world, the sinner has many advantages over the saint. That's a subject that warrants a completely different discussion, but oh my god, the questions of morals, the questions of, what's moral, what's good, what's ill, oh my god, it's such a superfluous conversation, such a superfluous subject, to be that's why I really like the Kabbalistic approach to morality. Basically, there is no good or bad. It's the way you approach to things, or something like that. It's the way you approach things. It's basically, the way you perceive or approach things. That's what makes it, that's how you make something good or bad for you. But there is no ultimate good, no ultimate evil, no ultimate bad. It's just whatever you make it in this world. That's actually probably the truest moral code, the most natural moral code that exists in mankind. Everything else is just artificial. Anybody can create. Any society has a flotilla of taboos, a flotilla of what makes good and bad. But like Friedrich Nietzsche had said in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is that I went to one village, and what was good there, it was considered bad in another village, and so on and so forth. That's the moral of the story. Just to illustrate the whole hypocrisy of the American morality. So in other countries, you say that one hand washes the other. You can say that you scratch my back, I scratch yours. And nowadays they have replaced all these concepts into this innocuous term called networking. Oh, I'm going to network. What it means is that I'm going to try to use other people and use my connections with other, friends and kind of acquaintances in order to gain something for myself, something selfish. And they use all these innocuous terms like networking. Oh my god, it doesn't sound bad, so therefore I can use it. And it's something that people have been using profusely. Oh my god. And what it means is that and that term is completely immoral. The same way as you say that I'm making connections. And I think people use this term, such as networking, to feel better about themselves, that they're not actually doing anything sinister, bad, or immoral. They're simply networking with other people. Well, but in actuality, it's basically using other people to, gain material and other economic advantages within their life. So he ends the chapter by talking about how the civilization has taught man how to live in crowded cities, and that this will continue on. He's not seeing that anything will change in that regard. And those that do not want to or are intolerable to living in crowded conditions will eventually die off and be replaced by people who are okay living in crowded conditions. And these conditions will improve, as we have seen that you can have a very densely populated city that has, good sanitation, good transportation and coming in and out of goods and waste. And when all those systems are present, you can have a pretty good and tolerable and enjoyable life in the city. So, but this will continue on. But the essential quality of humankind and of the species as a whole is obviously procreation. I think that's kind of the moral and the whole point of this chapter, that if you want to survive as a nation or as a species as a whole, you have to perpetuate yourself. So this concludes chapter called the species Homo sapiens, which is what chapter this is. Let me see. Chapter 5. And until next time on my book club on the Arsenic Theory channel. Thank you.